Yeah, so this is still me. No, I will.
I can give you a generic login so you're not under your personal one.
It's all right at this point. So you're...
If you want, yeah. Nothing.
You're Brian? Yes. Okay. Yeah, so I'll pull you up and you can play with it for a second. I'm going to run downstairs. Thank you so much. Right, because at this point we already have all the slides logged.
Oh, sweet.
Or, like, because we have them all queued up.
Oh, nice.
Right, so I don't want to switch with
logins and
yeah,
stuff.
I don't want to play with logins at this point.
That makes sense. For next year, if you don't want to use your own one, we have like a generic one we create every month for off-campus groups.
Oh, okay.
That we can let you use if you want.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah. You doing okay?
Yeah.
Did your back?
You heard?
Yeah. My back goes out all the time, so I feel
But
bad for
I
you.
just found my straight place. You know what I mean? How like like when it first happens, it really just straighten out, and then once you find you're straight, you're like, okay, now I just.
Anything, yeah.
All right, looks like it's working fine.
Okay, perfect.
All right, awesome.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I feel like I need it.
Oh, okay.
Because she's behind it.
Oh, that sucks. That's what I kind of wanted.
So this, you will see yours right here.
Okay.
So you can just open yours.
Well, it's just I need to click on something for audio, and at first
You'll
I thought
click
that
right
this
here.
wouldn't be, but if
No,
I can
you'll
do it there. Cool.
So forward, back.
Just like in class.
Yes, it's exactly like in class. No. Well, maybe that one right there.
Do you want to try it?
Yeah, sure, if you don't mind.
Are you going to need to pause the video?
Possibly.
To like enter.
I'm just curious if it might play fast.
This is,
It's this one. We'll see if this
oh,
one.
I see. You're just checking a different one.
Oh, well.
We can. Yep. And then, so the laser is right above these arrows. There's like a little depression there.
It's me, Mario.
It pauses it, but it doesn't seem to restart it. Oh, well.
What about the one next to it?
I didn't try it. Why?
I bet it doesn't because it looks like it goes.
It's me,
Press
Yeah.
that one again. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, well. Not a big deal. All right, thank you so much.
Will you open Madeleine's?
Which one is her?
This Switchello one.
Good afternoon and welcome to our last speaker session. Our first speaker is going to be Madeleine Rich from the Psychology Department.
All right, hello guys, I'm Madeleine and I am a graduating senior in the Psychology Department here at Fort Lewis. And I am asking the question about how personable we are to mindfulness. So to begin to talk about mindfulness and how it affects us, we need to explore how memory works. And there are two steps of memory. One is a short-term memory, but that is an antiquated term. It is simply a holding cell for before you transfer information from stimuli into long-term memory. The new kind of system that cognitive psychologists really enjoy using is called working memory. And this is a three-part system. Your first part in the system is the phonological loop, and this is the most similar to short-term memory. So it's the initial holding cell for kind of simplicity's sake of information that you've heard. So any stimulus that you hear is stored in this phonological loop. Then that is taken to your visual spatial sketchpad. So here, all that stimulus from your phonological loop is made into a mental image into your mind. We all like our mental images. And from there, that mental image is transferred to the central executive, and that is where your mind kind of decides what is going to happen with that information. So that whole working memory system is really important in encoding. So when you're encoding, you are gathering stimulus and storing that information, and obviously you take the stimulus, you hear it, you make a mental image, and you decide on it. Then that is transferred to long-term memory, and that is encoding. You then have retrieval, and retrieval is different from encoding because you're accessing that information that is stored. You're recollecting what you have just learned. But when you have poor retrieval, you are lacking information. So poor retrieval is not due to lack of attention while you're trying to access that information. It's not due to a distraction. It is due to distraction during encoding. If you think about it, you have false information coming in when you're hearing it, reading, whatever it may be, because you're distracted during that. Your mental image is wrong, and therefore your decision made from that information is wrong. But this is very natural, so don't worry. Humans do work in a manner which has worked best for them in the past. You have a system in place where you approach situations because it saves your attentional resources. Attentional resources are anything from emotional regulation to your ability to process difficult information. Of course, you want to reserve those for important times, but if you have a novel situation, you are presented with a time where you can learn a lot of information. So why would you necessarily want to apply habitual thought patterns to novel situations? You're not going to learn as much. But it's really hard to be attentive and focused in a novel situation. For me, this is a novel situation. Really have to focus to be attentive right now. This is where mindfulness can definitely come into play, though, and this was the main aspect of my study and something I have found to be very useful in my life, especially this past year, senior year. You have to be mindful while you're studying. So mindful is being aware of your thoughts and emotions in the present moment, but that is not enough. If you really want to get the most from your mindfulness activity, you not only need awareness, but you need attention and non-judgmental acceptance of the present moment. So this means, okay, you're thinking, oh, I'm nervous. You just accept that you're nervous. Right now I'm nervous. I'm just accepting it. This allows you to change your behavior from that automatic habitual patterns that you fall into really active, attentive, purposeful motions throughout whatever you're doing. And this also allows your surrendering of your attentional resources. So then all your brain power can be applied to whatever you're currently doing. So now I want to explore personality type, hence the personable to mindfulness. So when you have a personality type A, you tend to be a little more tense, A little bit more achievement-oriented, you're more impatient, you're a little restless, and these are typically your workaholics. I don't like that term, but that's what I found in the literature. When you are type B, you're a little more easygoing, you're a little less assertive, that's okay. You have higher levels of tolerance, which is really good, and you're a little more complacent. So as you can see, type A personalities, they're a little more high-strung. They have subjectively more stress to situations. And this matters because if you have more stress, you're going to have a little bit more anxiety. And when you have more anxiety, you're not going to be able to as fully activate your attentional resources to that event because your adrenaline is pumping a little bit more. So I wanted to explore the relationship between mindfulness and personality type. So I chose to do this because, yes, mindfulness is beneficial to everybody. It's been proven time and time again in literature, but I thought that it could help people with type A personalities a little bit more. They would gain a little bit more benefit from this stress reduction technique. So my hypothesis was that if my participants did a brief mindfulness activity directly before listening to an audio stimuli, they would recall more details in a recollection test that I administered later. If my participants did a filler activity, they would remember less details, and this filler activity was simply writing for a minute about a favorite childhood memory. But I predicted that an individual with the type A personality who participated in a mindfulness activity would remember the most details. So my participants consisted of psychology students at Fort Lewis. That was the most accessible. I had 38 participants in total, 12 were male, 26 were female. And I also asked them if they had any prior experience with meditation or mindfulness, and 22 participants said they had. This was important to me because the more you practice mindfulness, the more benefit you're going to gain from it. It builds on itself. I did have in my control group, which was the group that participated in that filler activity of writing about their favorite childhood memory, I had 17 participants in that group. In the experimental group, I had 21 participants, so they did the mindfulness activity. And now I'm going to kind of show you guys a little bit of my stimuli that I used in my experiment. So I did a between groups design. So that means that the participants who did the mindfulness activity only did the mindfulness, and the participants who did the filler activity only did that. They were in 2 separate classrooms, 2 separate times, and I made sure no participants were in both sets of classes. So, of course, they had informed consent. For those of you who are unsure what that means that their participation is completely voluntary. They were to receive no foreseeable benefits or risks, so that means no monetary incentive. They simply got class participation as the professor had discretion to do so. And also, like, if they needed to leave the room at any time, they didn't have to participate if they didn't want to. So now I am going to extend the same courtesy to you guys I did as my participants, but I am going to walk you through a 1-minute mindfulness activity that I created. Again, if you don't want to participate, you don't have to, but I'm extending this to you guys. So I'm now going to ask you all to sit up as straight as is comfortable and plant both your feet on the ground. Okay, I'm now going to ask you guys if you want to fully or partially close your eyes, and I want you to take 3 full deep breaths for me. Now I would like you all to continue to breathe at a comfortable pace, but make sure that the breath is a complete and full breath. I will ask you to continue this for 1 minute, and during that minute, please attempt to focus only on how your breath feels in your body, where you feel your breath, or perhaps the sound that it makes. If your mind wanders from breathing exercise, that is no problem. Please simply return your thoughts to your breath. Your 1 minute begins now. Your thoughts may have wandered from your breath. Please calmly return them back to your feelings. That's 1 minute. If you guys could calmly return back to this room. So that's the stimulus that they had received before I administered this lovely situation that I'm about to show you guys. So they did listen to 3 minutes of a story, an audio recording by Roald Dahl. It's called Beware of the Dog.
Down below there was only a vast, white, undulating sea of cloud. Above there was the sun, and the sun was white like the clouds, because it is never yellow when one looks at it from.
Okay, so that they listened to for 3 minutes, and of course, like, it was a story, so they listened to it. And also, this is the sound that they listened to after 1 minute 30 seconds had passed overlap. So I'm going to play both of them for you guys so you can kind of get a feel of it. For any like hypersensitive individuals, if you want to plug your ears, it's a little jarring in a way.
When I land, I'll sit there quite normally and say, "Some of you fellas come and help me."
Okay, so that's what they listened to. They did that, and then they did a recollection test. And my results, I did a statistical analysis called a two-way ANOVA with my alpha set at 0.05. It was again a between groups design, and the dependent variable was the number of correct answers that they did on an open recall test, where I simply asked them to list the number of results that they had in 1 minute. And one independent variable was a type A or type B personality. Another was a mindful or not mindful activity. So this is a lot to look at. Simply, this is an interaction that I tested for between mindfulness and a personality type. So you have this p-value here at the bottom, and what this means is that the chance that anything was by chance, and that's what is important here. So this graph shows you that this graph right here is learners. And why do we care about this? I wanted to see if there is a relationship between personality and mindfulness. There's not. That's okay. However, there is a relationship between attention and mindfulness. And again, that's just as important. That just supports future literature. And the reasons are because I didn't have any strong personality types. All my personality types were moderate. It was either moderate, strong A, strong B, or you get the point. There are no strongs. And also, mindfulness does semantic activation when you're listening to a story. So if you have that semantic activation, you're following that story, it helps you guide through it, and that mindfulness just gathered your attentional resources. And that is mindfulness and personality. So thank you guys for listening.
Yes, go ahead. This is you, right? We're in here? Can I just say they're in the program? Okay. Audience is totally shut.
Allison or Allie.
Okay. So for the streaming links that he just referred to, you can go to fortlewis.edu/symposium, and all the links will be there for the talks. Our next speaker is Ali Guerrero from the History Department.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As she said, my name is Ali Guerrero. I'm from the History Department, and I did my senior thesis on food in the making of an American identity, the co-option of American foodways by the middle class, and how that wound up shaping the American culinary identity. So when we talk about foodways, we're talking about the cultural, social, and economic practices and beliefs associated with food consumption and production processes. So literally everything from the ground to when you consume it. I wanted to start with this quote in particular. So the Duchess of Clermont-Tonnerre shows up in the United States in late 1919, has kind of an unsavory encounter with American foodways, and goes home and writes about it. And I like this quote because it really captures kind of this point in time in the 1890s and the 1920s where America is changing culturally, industrially, and it's really starting to show up in how Americans perceive themselves and how they start changing kind of the different markers of their identity. So my research questions revolved around how the middle class decided to use foodways to start shaping kind of the boundaries of their ideological, their racial, their social identity in terms of what does the middle class look like? What should a modern American be eating? What should they be thinking? What should they be believing? How did middle class foodways become representative of American culinary culture? We see vestiges of this nowadays, particularly in the ways we define the foodways of the poor, the foodways of other ethnic Americans. And then what conditions ultimately facilitated this kind of widespread dissemination of this very specific, distinct class identity? The thesis wound up being the American urban middle class utilized foodways as a mechanism for reinforcing and propagating their own distinct class-oriented identity and social hierarchy. So kind of setting up the social context for why the middle class was able to do what they did. So we have this industrial consumer society emerging in the 1890s. We have unprecedented levels of wealth boosting the middle class, creating the middle class, while also elevating the elite class of the United States. The elite classes are changing their culture to emulate more of kind of a European style, which is where we kind of get this French haute cuisine coming about. But at the same time, the rise of industry is facilitating the rise of the middle class. By 1910, they are the largest growing class in the United States because industry needs office workers. Office workers are white class workers, which are elevating socially the middle class above the working class who are simply working for wages. In this, we have the new role of women. Women are being pushed out into the public sphere. They're allowed to do new social roles, but at the same time, they're being expected to kind of participate in this long-standing idea that women should cultivate domesticity, submissiveness, and that they're inherently more pure and religious than men. So while all of this is going on, this is up against this backdrop of immigration and urban poverty really creating some anxiety in the upper class of the United States. At this time, scientifically and sociologically speaking, we have theories about race degeneration and eugenics popping up. And what the middle class and the elite classes are very concerned about is the fact that we have roughly 28 million immigrants coming in between 1890 and 1920. What are these immigrants doing to the United States? Why, in this time of unprecedented wealth, do we have such crazy numbers of the urban poor filling up kind of the lower levels of urban society? So the middle class responds to kind of this plight of the poor, this kind of rampant poverty, with domestic science as a way to improve the environment, to improve the biological and kind of social conditions of the poor, to effectively create better Americans. This kind of ties back into this dysgenesis or this eugenics movement where there's this belief that the incoming influx of immigrants or this influx of unfit individuals will bring about kind of the fall of the American kind of new modern industrial ideal. In this kind of new domestic science movement, and it's very much a reform movement, women play a very critical role because they're seen as more authoritative. They have more legitimate motives behind trying to improve kind of the poor, the working class. And at this point, too, we start to see this transmission of women's responsibility to shape the home environment, to shape the basic family unit, which is the basic unit of American society. That responsibility becomes kind of a public mission. So the gospel of good cooking, benevolence, science, and the quest for men's hearts through their stomachs. So my project really wanted to look at how the middle class was beginning to kind of spread these ideas that, one, women as the keepers of the home ideal and the family unit should be pushing that role out into the public sphere to improve American society. Fundamentally, what did that do to American foodways? Tangibly, what did that mean? And then ultimately, how are they able to disseminate this? And what I largely found it was through cookbooks and through cooking courses, as they're trying to indoctrinate housekeepers and future housekeepers in this idea that, one, it's their responsibility to shape American society through food and through the domestic sphere. And two, they needed a very simple, calculable cuisine that they could teach people and that they can kind of imbue with the proper principles that were becoming of modern Americans. So my main text for kind of my literature review and kind of setting up my theoretical framework looked at two texts that specifically set up the fact and identified that something was very distinctly going on during this period. Foodways were changing because they were simplifying. Again, the upper classes were kind of experimenting with this kind of European ideal and European style of living, which involved haute cuisine, which is a very kind of complex, nuanced style of eating. Middle class responds to this in some way that they need to kind of fuse science and this new kind of, it's called new nutrition, so about the 1830s, our contemporary concepts of like macronutrients, fats, carbohydrates, proteins, start popping up, and this becomes very much the language of the middle class when they start thinking about food. This is very, very different than prior to this period. So the middle class starts to integrate these concepts in addition to kind of these ideas that you need to be simplistic. There needs to be a way to teach these values and calculate these values to people who don't necessarily have a background in science and nutrition. And then with that, food and culture text brought up a couple of essays, one particular from anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, talking about cookbooks as a way to kind of identify unity and difference within a population, and the fact that cookbooks are very prescriptive texts. So a lot of the cookbooks that were produced at this time weren't necessarily practical in a lot of senses. Most homemakers who are experienced don't necessarily need cookbooks. That's very true nowadays. But they're creating an ideal that people should aspire to, and even if they couldn't tangibly aspire to it, they needed to kind of align their ideals and their morals and their principles with this idea that the middle class was promoting, because in that sense, aspiring to that or choosing to participate in that ideal was kind of allowing them to participate in the middle class, and inability to do so would mean exclusion from the middle class ideal. So this text is kind of one of the early front runners of this movement of domestic science and kind of putting these new ideals into the hands of the public. And we see a very distinct kind of ideal coming about, that you need to be simplistic. There should be a kind of sense of self-denial and discretion involved with eating. This is no longer about gratifying the senses. This is about performing your class identity, your class ideology based on how you're consuming, your consumption patterns. Next, we see this fusion of science and the kitchen coming about, domestic science, where the emphasis is in furnishing a certain amount of food principle in its cheap rather than its dear form. So we're seeing this emphasis of science, of economics, of morality being put above the fact that it should probably taste good and be consumable. Again, from this kind of early text by Mary Hinman Abel. And then in this next one, we see the role of the woman in the house being very clearly defined. It is their responsibility to kind of biologically and environmentally create moral, proper Americans. This goes back to a very early ideal that I mentioned earlier that's been cultivated since the Revolutionary War, this cult of true womanhood, that they should be cultivating ideals of domesticity, submissiveness, and purity. This next one is probably one of my favorite texts to look at. Cookbooks is creating a sense of difference. So this text looks at, one, integrating immigrants into the United States culture by kind of very slowly adjusting their foodways. And I find it interesting that in the beginning of the text she talks about the fact that why would you kick a man while he's down? Why would you try to adjust something very intimate when these immigrants are coming into a new traumatic situation? But at the same time setting up the fact that the way that they're eating is not proper, that the way that they're eating is creating all the social ills in their own home environment, and that as new Americans, they need to adjust. The fact that they need to eat more healthfully, that they need to subscribe to the middle-class foodways to be able to participate properly in American society and hopefully eventually be fully assimilated and contributing members of society. So fundamentally, my conclusions, and I'll leave you with this, is the fact that American foodways during the 1890s and the 1920s were largely a response to kind of the social chaos that was going on. While industrialization was forcing Americans to kind of reconsider their social identity, their ideological identity, the middle class took this as a chance to kind of begin to shape what they thought proper Americans should look like, what proper Americans should be eating, and how proper Americans should be built, especially from the home unit. We're looking at very kind of simplistic meals that are very basic, one in taste and both kind of in process. Meals at this point in time are identified to start getting smaller. The French cuisine, particularly during this period, is very complex. You're looking at 12-course meals that are, it's very much a ritualistic thing. The rituals changed by the middle class. It becomes a performance of kind of self-denial, of demonstrating wholesomeness through kind of like really boiled, bland, American-sourced foods, as compared to kind of this excessive or kind of immoral, uneconomical culture cultivated by both the working class and the upper classes. So that is it, and that was very fast. Any questions? Anything at all? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So during this period, we have what we call the third wave. Prior to this period, immigrants play into this idea of whiteness, so Teutonic or Anglo-Saxon, so they're Western European. In the 1890s, there's a shift. They start coming from the Mediterranean region. They start coming from Eastern Europe. We have people coming in from Mexico and Asia, and these are stereotypically non-white peoples in kind of like the 19th century sense, where they're not Protestant. They're not coming from countries where the basic kind of economic system is capitalism. And in that sense, they're a threat to kind of the new American industrial identity because, again, they're not Christian. They're enormous family sizes, and they're just fundamentally not living in ways that are seen to kind of be strengthening the American character as a white country. Any other questions? Thank you.
So a couple of quick announcements while we're waiting for people who might be stepping in. This is the last talk here in this room. There are still several more talks in the Vicito room this afternoon after this one is done. And then please join us at 4:15 right back here for the gala. So. So our next speaker is Brian Stubbs from Native American and Indigenous Studies.
Chokma, Chinchokma, Sachahofat, Brian Stubbs, Chickashaseya. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Stubbs, and I'm a Chickasaw citizen. Olba, Ishchikoshkamo, Chikoshkamo, Sabana, Ishkano, Saya. I play video games. Do you play video games? Games are an important part of what it means to be human. Every society have used games to inform their youth or to pass the time. As babies, our parents play peekaboo with us. Toddlers play hide and seek. And by the time we're in school, playgrounds, there are two games kids know almost inherently: cops and robbers and cowboys and Indians. And as our electronic devices become more prevalent, so too do the games that we play on them. Unfortunately, many of these video games rely on the good versus evil, us versus them, and the inherent othering of groups. Unfortunately, many of these, every generation enjoys believing that they have made improvements on their understandings of empathy towards the other. This is an old 1986 Nintendo game, but the actual story is based on a Chinese myth: the Monkey King travels west. So, have we really changed that much? The goal of my research was to examine the lack of representation of indigenous cultures in video games. However, I quickly found out it was not a lack of representation, but completely invisible. Indigenous worldviews and perceptions are distorted within the Western interpretations of their epistemologies. This presentation examines just a few of these tropes in interactive media and that have used to render indigenous people invisible.
It's me, Mario, from Super Mario's video game. What's coming to go?
So there are not many people today who haven't played at least one of the over 200 Mario games published from his very first game on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Mario has not only set the foundation, but advanced the bar on what video games are and can be. But what if I told you he had a dark side? What if I told you he's a colonizer? I know I was shocked, heartbroken even, but this might all just be a Gomba conspiracy theory. We assume that Mario is the hero of the Mushroom Kingdom, coming to rescue the Princess Peach. However, if one is to read the instruction booklet for Super Mario Bros., it mentions how the mushroom people were turned into stones and bricks by Bowser. The bricks you punch in the game are the transformed bricks he's supposed to be saving, of the mushroom people he's supposed to be saving. And the bad guys are a tribe of turtles, and the Goombas are mushrooms who betrayed the Mushroom Kingdom, which sounds like a simulation discourse strategy. Mario is new to the Mushroom Kingdom. He's navigating his perspective through various new worlds he must explore. This is an interesting parallel to the invasion of Columbus. There's another word for exploration and navigation indigenous people know well: colonization. So when examining video games, their much older cousins in board games show the groundwork for colonization Native Americans have experienced. The development of tabletop games from the 1960s to 80s were indirectly tied to the development of video game systems and their games. Both use complex systems of numbers to determine the outcomes. The only difference in the games are the speed at which computers can roll the dice. The board game Risk is one of the most popular board games ever created. Released in 1957, near the start of the Cold War, the game is to conquer every known territory in the game. In doing so, you eradicate the other players' armies along the way. There is no timetable for Risk. However, if you look at the artillery and cavalry, place it somewhere in the 18th or 19th century, just as the concept of nationalism was taking off. Risk presents a world where every player is equal playing field, while at the same time rendering invisible the original inhabitants of the colonized world. Settlers of Catan is an economic conquest game. The players have no military. Each player takes turns selecting tiles on a map that represent land and resources they hold. The objective is to gather resources and build a corporate empire. Catan presents the fantasized myth of manifest destiny as an empty, untamed land for settlers to exploit. Here I am colonizing Dungeons and Dragons with some friends. In D&D, the barbarians is a class of playable characters, where that slide seems to be missing. During one game, I'm going to skip that then. So while Mario hid his colonization past, Risk and Catan should hide away from mentioning it. Some games don't even hide their attempted colonization, which further represents indigenous peoples' invisibility in games. Perhaps the worst and most noteworthy is the Civilization series here. The series represents indigenous peoples' swings on a pendulum with each new release. Okay. Supposed to play a video there. There it goes. So Civilization is a turn-based strategy game, history simulator that spans all of recorded time, bringing us the story of man from agriculture to the internet. Not to recreate actual history, the events that shaped and turned the world, or patterns of the world, but the patterns of history, the overall direction of mankind. Gameplay consists of players competing with one another to build world wonders, such as the Pyramid or Mesa Verde in their cities and to expand their territory. The players attempt to win by dominating with military might, religious, economic, technological, or political power, while at the same time attempting not to fall too far behind in any one category. Whichever player has the most combined points by 2050 AD wins the game. As a kid, I always felt I was learning something about history, from key scientific breakthroughs to which leaders went with which civilization. As an adult, I see the underlying assumptions here being put forth in the game's mechanics. The game doesn't actually show the patterns of history, but patterns of a specific lens through which history is viewed in Eurocentric history. So if a player chooses the Iroquois and select to lead as Hiawatha and has advanced into the technology tree to the Renaissance, they could build the Eiffel Tower in Onondaga. The game allows for players to rewrite history, providing a whole storehouse of experiments on dead people. Many education problems have been deep roots in the past. Civilization's mechanics present a playground where you can experiment with history. Sorry, my slides are a little bit off, it seems like. Okay, there. So scholars have made the argument that video games are the modern form of colonization. In Playing Subaltern, Video Games in Post-Colonialism, Mukherjee concludes, the video game, therefore, is a metaphor that makes the ambulance all the more obvious. Alternative narratives can be written into the being in the game world, but only within the systems that the game provides. The player, whether from the erstwhile colonized countries or elsewhere, nevertheless both write and write back into the game that engage with the question relating to colonialism, whether he or she chooses to or not. There it is. Okay, there we go. So in every new release, there's never more than one Native American nation. Each numbered title receives an expansion pack that may increase the number of playable civilizations that are included in the game. Civilization 3 was the first in the series to include Native American nations, with Hiawatha as the leader. In Civilization 4, we received all Native Americans grouped to one nation, as the Native American nation with Sitting Bull as their leader. By Civilization 5, they had decided that the Shoshone nation should represent the game. Now with Civilization 6, they have released the Cree as the next nation to be presented in the game without the Cree's approval. They selected the Cree leader as Pound Maker, although he never led the nation as a leader at any particular time. In another series, the Halo game, the first-person shooter, takes place in the distant future where an alien force known as the Covenant are invading a human planet colony known as Harvest. The Covenant proclaim that their destruction of humanity is the will of the gods. The Covenant forces are promised a great journey. When taken together, the parallels of the Halo games and the events to European invasion are not surprising, as many have speculated an alien invasion would be similar to the European invasion. The planet Harvest symbolizes early colonial life and the early pilgrims that came to America. The great journey that the Covenant are on is a salvation only for the advanced. It symbolizes the Catholic Church and its doctrine of discovery. Similar to the dynamics to humans and the Covenant, the construction of the American sovereignty, national identity, came from the displacement of Native American nations. In the series, the Covenant are able to find Earth by following a UNSC spaceship named the Iroquois back to Earth. The irony of naming a spaceship intended for the facilitation of colonization of other planets after indigenous nations. The game presents a strange type of historical reversal. UNSC Space Marines serve as the extension of colonialism, yet at the same time, the fleet presents itself as the victims of the Covenant's colonization. The game presents a type of irony for the creators. For the otherness the West fears in specific Islamic fundamentalism is embodied in the Covenant, but the very history of colonization. So I've talked a lot about the games, but not much about the developers of games. A few of the developers are John J. Romero. He's pretty famous in the industry if you played the Doom games, which gave birth to the first-person shooter genres and the Halo game that I just mentioned. Another one is, besides this, most Native Americans are nearly excluded from the industry. In the industry, there are a handful of Native American game developers. As I mentioned, John Romero here, who gave birth to the first-person shooter genre, as well as Elizabeth LaPence, who aims to correct the issues with the game developments where the center of knowledge is put at the forefront. She developed a game called Thunderbird Strike. In this side-scrolling shooter game, the player assumes the role of a thunderbird whose mission is to destroy the snakes that represent oil pipelines while avoiding nature such as trees and deers. The game has been branded eco-terrorism by oil companies, while Native communities, educational institutions, and environmentalist groups praise it. Another game is Never Alone. Players experience the oral traditions of the Inupiaq Nation from a traditional language with modern gameplay. Players take on the role of Nuna and her fox as they search for the reasons behind a never-ending blizzard threatening the survival of her people. The game is an atmospheric puzzler platform, a game similar to how Mario runs across the stage. It was developed by the company Eline Media, with the Inupiaq Nation of Alaska providing the tradition, story, and art that was drawn from the traditions shared across the generations. The voiceover work for the game was provided by James Nagineka. I probably mispronounced that. An elder of the community, and every elder contributed a portion of their version of the oral tradition to ensure a variation within the game's story, as well as traditional Inupiaq art to inform the future. Not only does Never Alone highlight a new tool and methods for which indigenous people can use toward decolonization instead of colonization, it validates indigenous oral traditions. Another is Aboriginal Technology Territories in Cyberspace. This is a network of academics, artists, and technologists whose goal is to define and share conceptual and practical tools that will allow us to create new Aboriginally determined territories within web pages, online games, and virtual environments that we call cyberspace. It's a multifaceted workshop where they include all types of interactive media. Their main goal is to implement methods by which youth can preserve and produce their knowledge from their cultures and languages in this highly technological society. So what would Mario do? What would you do? Well, we already know. Mario's actions are our own actions. The players are the ones controlling Mario. We become Mario. Video games, in a Western sense, are inherently othering. The player is, in Mario's case, literally on the sidelines, and it's easy for people to form opinion without ever experiencing something. We go by what we are told. Mario is the hero, and we follow. but the truth behind Mario may change the way you play the game. After I played through this game again, you can play the game and beat it without killing any single enemy, besides Bowser. Okay, that was a little out of order. So now that I've shifted how you might think about the context of Mario, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, well, that's the end. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you back here at 4:15 for the gala and movie screening, and there are a couple of other talks downstairs in the Vicedo room for the rest of the afternoon. Turn this off just to save your battery, but